Okay, all right, here we are. So we're going to talk about some exercising around injury. So specifically, there's really 4 different pieces that we want to talk about. So the first piece is just kind of looking at like injury myths and mistakes. When it comes to this topic, I think there's a lot of not necessarily wrong information, but just a lot of information that doesn't always provide context. And I think with most things, context is often the missing piece. So after that, we're going to look at some of the principles of programming around injuries. These are some of the kind of fundamental things that I think about and we talk about internally as a team, as far as like how do we work around, what are some of those like big rocks or principles that we want to think about with injuries. What should we do and what shouldn't we do? And then the third thing we're going to talk about is steps to take when returning from injury, because if you're, the longer you exercise, a lot of times there's going to be something, whether it's on vacation, at home, helping someone move, we're going to have bumps and bruises along the way. And I think exercise is extremely important for everyone. So knowing the steps that you can take and how to return from an injury, I think is extremely important. And then we're going to talk about preventative measures to hopefully prevent and avoid injuries altogether. And then we're going to kind of wrap this up just real quick on like why this matters. And to kind of start with there, like, why I think this topic is so important. There's really 2 things in particular. One is because, when we think about exercise and obviously I'm biased, but I think there's nothing more important in the entire world, because if we don't have our health, like nothing else matters. If we don't have our health, we're not going to be there to help our family out, to perform at work, to take care of those, our kids or friends, and to help all those people out. So when we think about why this matters, it's because when you look at the benefits of exercise, you can't replace it. There's no pill and there's no substitution for just the impact on your strength, your body composition, just your general heart health. More and more, just in recent years, we're even seeing more and more of a connection, just like in your emotional health and mental health. And in a lot of it, it's exercise. I forgot who said it, but it was, if the benefits of exercise weren't a pill, it'd be the most popular pill on the entire planet. So I think, looking at the benefits of exercise, the benefits are just so great that you can't avoid it. You can't skip it or put it off till later. So even when you're dealing with injuries, I think it's something that you really have to do your best to try to make it work to one degree or another. And then also something that I think doesn't get enough cover or a lot thought is when we're thinking about like why this matters, it's because injuries often tend to derail people from their exercise routine. And if we think about habits and routines, they are very hard to form. I look back just a couple of years ago when COVID happened and the world kind of shut down. There were so many people over the next year that I would talk to, and it was literally the same story time and time again. I worked out religiously, everything, and then I stopped working out when COVID started, and now I'm here to get restarted a year and a half later. It took people, again, we heard that story time and time again, and it just to me was such a huge reminder about the importance of our habits and our routine. And so once we get out of those routines, once we break those habits, it is so hard to get started again. So I want to I don't want people to have to go through that restarting phase, and that's why it's extremely important to me to try to figure out ways to help people exercise, even if they are dealing with an injury or nursing an injury or trying to avoid making something worse. So that's kind of what the gist of what we're going to run through here. But so starting with the injury myths and mistakes. So one of the most common mistakes is this idea that like, oh, you just need to rest. So the example I use is when you look at like high level athletes that have to use their body for that's how they make a living. So they can't take time off from the field, the court, or whatever it is from their games. When they get hurt, they don't rest. They might be in a pool doing some workouts, they're doing physical therapy, but when you look at people that are bouncing back from injuries, even at the highest level, they're taking maybe a day or two off after surgery, and then they're working on getting right back in the swing of things. Now, of course, they're not going full force. They're not returning to a game immediately or to competition immediately, but they are moving, and so they are moving. They are exercising. Might be at an extremely low intensity, but they are beginning that recovery process as soon as possible. So the idea of just rest, in my opinion, is kind of more of a Band-Aid approach. And the reason is because the biggest indicator, physical therapist Greg Cook has done a lot of research on this, the biggest indicator of injury is previous injury. So if there's one thing to look at that's like, what are the odds of this person getting hurt? The most obvious thing to look at is, have they been hurt before? In particular, in that particular muscle, joint, bone, whatever, tendon, ligament, whatever it is. So and part of the reason is because when people just rest, it might help with the inflammation, but it's kind of a Band-Aid approach. They're not really getting to the underlying root of the problem. And we're going to talk about why that is here in just a minute. So the next biggest injury myth is that the point of pain is not always the problem. So we have a lot of folks that will see that, they'll be dealing with back pain, and once we dig into it, once we really figure out what's going on, it's the problem isn't really the back. The problem is oftentimes the joint above or below. And so, for instance, a common saying from another physical therapist acquaintance of mine is that the hips are a bad neighbor. And so when your hips aren't functioning properly, it tends to not cause problems at the hips. It tends to cause problems at the knees and the low back. And it's because those areas are having to overcompensate because the hips aren't functioning the way they're intended to. So again, the point of pain isn't always the problem. And so we have to keep in mind that the body functions as one unit. So if we have a problem in one area, it's not necessarily that if the back hurts, the back's the problem. It could be, but more times than not, that's not the case. It's something that's happening, again, above or below that joint. And then the last thing in regards to injury myths and mistakes is this idea of this like light switch versus dimmer switch approach. And so the analogy I use is when most people think of coming back from an injury or think of nursing an injury, it's like, okay, I'm doing physical therapy, and then or I'm resting for a period, and then I go to physical therapy, and then I'm going to go back to working out. And it's like when one starts, one stops. And that's more of a light switch approach, where it's like it's this all or nothing idea. And in reality, these things should overlap. So it shouldn't be like you just stop and then you restart. It's the same thing. I give a lot of runners a hard time because runners are I've never seen a group that will, they'll be, resting or taking time off or going to physical therapy, and then their first day back to running, I'll talk to them and they're like, oh yeah, I just ran like 5 miles this morning, like no big deal. And I, laugh about it. It drives me nuts because it's like, rather than, again, a dimmer switch and building up slowly, that's one group, and a lot of other folks do it, but that's the easiest example to pick on because it happens all the time. But people will just go back full steam ahead and go back to what they were doing instead of making it more of a gradual approach. And depending on the severity of the injury, depending on the situation, depending on a lot of other variables, it's much more appropriate and it's much safer to do a more gradual ramp up, which is why I use the analogy of like a dimmer switch. We should ramp things back up slowly and gradually over generally a series of weeks, potentially months, depending on what we're talking about here. So those are, again, 3 kind of the big mistakes that commonly come up when it comes to injuries. When we're looking at the principles of programming around injuries, there's really 4 things in particular that are kind of the big rocks of what we're doing. Now, there's a lot of other variables that you could look at. There's a lot of other things that come into play. But to not keep you here all night, and just for like simplicity purposes, these are kind of like the biggest four that I think of when it comes to like what are the principles of working around injuries. And the first one is the idea that when we're working around injuries, we oftentimes need to adjust the acute training variables so that we can increase the demand without increasing the load. So a good example of this would be if someone needs to cut back on the weight. Let's just say we use it's a hand or wrist issue, and they need to reduce some of the weight that they're using because their grip strength is suffering for whatever reason. So maybe they can't, normally they would pull with 100 pounds, but we don't need to do that because, again, we need to let that joint or that area heal a little bit. So what we could do, one example would be to put them in a more unstable position so that it doesn't require as much of an external load in order to still challenge them appropriately. So a good example would be, instead of doing some sort of rowing movement from a very stable position, which would require more of an external load, but if we're trying to reduce the stress on that hand or wrist, we could have them do that same movement from a single leg position. Well, now all of a sudden we've made it more challenging because we put them in a more unstable position. So now the movement requires less external load to still challenge them appropriately, which would again allow that hand and wrist to a little bit of a break. Another example would be if we're doing something as simple as like a anti-rotation type movement where we generally will hold a cable machine and press it out away from us. Another way to put someone in a more unstable position to make it more challenging so that they don't have to use as much external load would be to just narrow their stance. By narrowing their stance, they've got a more narrow base of support. They're in a more unstable position. So now it requires less of an external load. So a good example for that would be if someone has a shoulder issue and pressing out a heavy weight aggravates that shoulder for some reason, which it does for some individuals. If we still want to challenge the core, but we need to use less external load to not aggravate the shoulder, we could do so by just narrowing the base of support. So now they're more unstable because they've got a narrow foundation, and now we can still challenge the core appropriately while using less external load, which would then allow the shoulder to rest. So again, when we look at adjusting the acute training variables, one of the things we could do is look at making something more or less stable, all right, so that we don't have to use as much external load. So another thing that we could adjust would be the tempo. It's very simple. Probably the easiest way to make an exercise more challenging so that we can crank up the challenge to where it's more challenging without cranking up the external load would be to adjust the tempo, and just by slowing down the movement. So if we are trying to maybe someone's coming back from a back issue, and we're going to do a squat with them, but we don't want them to hold too much weight because that's going to compress their spine. A solution around that, so that it would require, again, less external load, would be to simply use a lighter weight, but then to control the tempo so that they're going down much slower, or we could add a pause at the bottom or come up slower. Again, there's a lot of ways we can adjust the tempo, but tempo is another way that we can adjust a small variable so that we can still challenge the person appropriately without adding a ton of weight. So, because oftentimes when someone's coming back from injury, or if we're trying to not make an injury worse, one of the ways we can go about that is to, again, we want to challenge them without having to crank up the weights a ton. And how we do that is by adjusting these acute training variables so that we can still challenge them without using a bunch of weight. So another example of adjusting an acute training variable would be to change the range of motion. And so, for instance, if we were doing a rowing type movement, we could potentially just not go out all the way so that the muscle's under tension for an extended period of time. So we could again, just a couple different ways that we can adjust other variables so that we're not only changing the weight. Because we want to be able to, when necessary, challenge someone and increase that challenge on someone without necessarily having to increase the load. And again, there's a lot of reasons why that could be, but that's one of the things that we want to think about as far as one of the principles that we're using on a daily basis is how can we challenge this person appropriately, which may need to make it harder or easier without necessarily having to increase the weight. So one of the other things, the principles of programming around injuries that we think about is the contralateral strength training effect. This is something that still to this day is very misunderstood, but it's really interesting. The first research behind this was a study done at Yale in 1894. So on grip strength. This has been around an extremely long time, yet it's not talked about in everything that I've read. The reason it's not talked about is because doctors and researchers don't really understand why. But they know what happens, but they don't understand why. And I don't either, but I know it works. And the contralateral effect of exercise in this Yale study, which again was done almost 130 years ago, they were working with someone on their grip strength, and they had them squeezing like a stress ball repeatedly. And what they found was by only squeezing the stress ball in the right hand, their left hand actually got stronger. So there's a contralateral effect. Again, researchers don't understand why it happens, but they know it happens. So now, are you going to gain as much strength as you are in the hand that you're working? No, it's not that. But again, if you're coming back from what you say a knee injury, and you know you, especially coming back from an injury, you need that limb to be strong, and you need to get it strong as quick as you can. Well, if you can't necessarily work that issue because maybe that area because there's still inflammation, a way around that to still help get that stronger would be to work the other leg. And again, it's because of this contralateral strength training effect. People don't know why it works, but it does. And so that's one of the things. If we're nursing the left shoulder, or trying to take it easy on the left shoulder, we'll still work the right shoulder. We still want to do other things because there's this transfer effect that takes place in the body that, like a lot of things with the human body, we don't understand, what's happening scientifically, but we just know that it works. And again, this has been out for almost 130 years. We're still trying to figure it out. So one of the other things that, when the principles of programming, and this kind of goes back to the point where what I mentioned earlier, the point of pain isn't the problem. It's something called the joint by joint effect, the joint by joint approach. And so how this stems from a physical therapist by the name of Greg Cook came up with this concept. And in the joint by joint approach is basically the idea that the human body is just a series of stackable joints with alternating needs. And so, for instance, our ankle, starting at the ground, our ankle generally needs more mobility. All right, our ankle generally needs to be more mobile. And the reason that is often, it really stems back to most of the shoes that we wear have a heel lift, which over time, we then lose ankle dorsiflexion, which means we can't, our ankle it's not as mobile as what it should be, or as what it was designed to be, which that then impacts our ability to squat and all kinds of other things. But our ankle joint typically needs to be more mobile, all right? We need it to move more, all right? Moving right up the line, our knee joint generally needs to be more stable. Our knee joint is kind of like a door hinge. We don't want that thing moving all over the place. That's going to cause more problems. So our knee joint generally needs to be more stable. Now, moving right on up the chain here of joints, our hips typically need to be more mobile. So we went mobile, now we need more stability, now we need more mobility. And if you think about our hips, because we sit all day, every day, they tend to get stiff. And so again, generally we need our hips to be more mobile. And when they're not mobile, then we end up compensating, and that's where our knees and our low back take a lot of abuse. And it's because our hips aren't functioning properly, and they're generally tight, and they're not as mobile as what they should be. Moving on up to our lumbar spine needs to be more stable. When we look at our spine, generally, down at the lumbar section, each vertebrae is only meant to move about I think it's 2 degrees of rotation, So our lumbar spine is not, people are always rotating, and turning, but that rotation on our spine is not really supposed to come from our lumbar spine. Our lumbar spine needs to be more stable. It's not really meant to move. Now, moving on up to the thoracic spine, now that needs to be more mobile. So our thoracic spine, again, we're just going right up, alternating stability. We need more stability, we need more mobility. So looking at our thoracic spine, that needs to be more mobile. And if we think about it, what's our problem? Again, it goes back to sitting down. We sit like this all the time. So we get stuck and we can't move through our thoracic spine, which then, if our thoracic spine can't move or can't function well, what happens? We end up compensating and trying to force movement through our lumbar spine, which isn't designed to move. But the body's going to figure out a way. Whatever we want to do, the human body will figure out a way to do it. It may hurt you, it may cause problems, but if you need to bend down to do something, you're going to figure out a way to do it. So whether it's good or bad, you'll do what you need to do. The problem is, it oftentimes is going to cause more problems. So the thoracic spine needs to be more mobile. And then the last sequence in the chain is the glenohumeral joint, and that needs to be more stable. Our shoulders, we have to be careful, they need to be more stable. We don't want them just flailing all over the place. That's what's oftentimes going to lead to injury. So again, this joint by joint approach is something that comes into play. And if there was one thing here that was probably, like, if there was one takeaway here that I think would really help people, it would be related to this, and it's just understanding, because again, the body functions as one unit, everything works together, and if you have pain in one issue, a lot of times it has nothing to do with that. It has to do with the joint above or below it, and it could be because it needs to be more mobile, it could be because it needs to be more stable. So again, there's a lot of things going on here, which I think is one of the reasons why injuries are so confusing, because there's so many variables at play that could be playing a part. The last principle that we think about when it comes to programming around injuries is this idea of, like, okay, so we know we have things we need to work on. We have joints that maybe we need to work on getting more stable. We have joints that maybe we need to work on getting more mobile. We have areas that maybe we need to strengthen, whether it's our core, stretches we need to do. Again, there's a lot of things that we need to do. Well, where do we do it? And my belief on this is that it doesn't matter. It's less about, I think people tend to over focus on, like, so should I do this first thing in the morning, or should I do it at night? Should I do it before my workout? Should I do it after my workout? And my belief is that you should do it when you'll do it. It's less about finding the perfect time and more about finding the time that you'll actually do it. Because at the end of the day, in my opinion, it's less about finding the ideal time and more about just getting people to do stuff. Because it's, whether it's like with nutrition or other things, for the most part, we know what we need to be doing. It's just actually doing it. We all know probably should eat a little less pizza, drink a little less wine, drink a little more water and veggies, but we don't do it. So again, it's pot calling the kettle black here, but so no judgment, but that's what, like I said, we should worry less about, like, creating this, like, perfect system, and more about, like, when will we actually do it realistically? You got to know yourself and know that, like, for me, the idea of stretching in the evening, it ain't happening. I don't care how much pain I'm in. I'm not going to stretch at night. It's just not going to happen. I will first thing in the morning, but I won't do it at night. I've learned that that's what works for me. So when I've got things I need to work on, I'm going to do them first thing in the morning, because that's when I'll actually do it. So whether it's the best time or not to do it doesn't really matter. So it's more just about figuring out, knowing yourself and knowing when you could do it. But you could do the things that you need to do. You could do it. It could be something you sprinkle into your warm up. It's one of the reasons, and we don't really oftentimes go into why. We don't oftentimes go into some of the why behind it. But a good example, we just talked about how the thoracic spine needs more mobility. Well, if you notice in our warm-ups here, we have people do those wall slides. Now you know why. So it's because we're trying, because people need more thoracic mobility. So yeah, it's good to warm up the shoulders, but it's also kind of a corrective exercise to work on a very specific, we do this and it's very specific because this is something we're trying to work on, because generally everyone needs to work on the mobility through the thoracic spine, because if they don't, they're going to have issues with generally with either the low back or the shoulder, because again, things that when you've got issues, it's going to generally impact you above or below the joint. So it could be doing it during a warm-up. It could be doing it during a cool down at the end of your workout. It could be doing it during your workout. I kind of sprinkle it in sometimes. Some individuals will sprinkle in like stretching or balance exercise or kind of stability exercises throughout a workout. Again, there's no right or wrong answer. It's just more about like when does it make the most sense given this person or this situation. It could be, again, first thing in the morning, at night. It's less about finding the right time and more just about doing it. So when we think about like steps to take when returning from an injury, there's really three things in particular that come to mind. So first one is like do no harm. So again, exercise, you have to find the right intensity. You have to find the appropriate intensity on a continuum. Again, this kind of goes back to that dimmer switch and light switch example. You've got to ease into things. When I think about my favorite kind of analogy or joke is that nothing drives me more crazy than someone coming in and saying, my doctor told me not to squat. Because my response is always, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. So you can't go to the bathroom? Because that is a squat. So again, it's speaking in absolutes that I think is the problem. Again, if someone says, oh, I can't do any squats, it's like, yeah, you can, just maybe not loaded squat, maybe not squats with an external load. Because again, if you can't squat, then, the person that told you that's telling you not to go to the bathroom. Because, I don't know. Unless there's another way I'm unaware of, but we won't go down that rabbit hole. So, again, but it's thinking about, again, exercise falls on a continuum, and we've got to figure out, what that looks like. This idea that like, oh, you can't do this, or you have to do this, oftentimes it's kind of misleading. It may be we can't do this with an external load, so we need to back off. Or, maybe we're going to do a squat, but we're going to hold the TRX straps so we can even take more weight off, which would actually be even less resistance than when you go to the bathroom because you've got something to help support you. So again, everything falls on a continuum, and we want to figure out what's appropriate for that individual. Now, that might mean avoiding certain movements entirely, and that's okay too. The easiest example here would be like a shoulder issue. If someone is just coming back from some sort of shoulder issue, we might not do any sort of pressing movements at all. In fact, there's a lot of folks that we don't do hardly any pressing with here at Blue Ocean. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that, because there's 30 other things we can work on that will still help them overall. So in certain situations, we may avoid working, certain joints. We may avoid working them through a full range of motion, or like doing overhead presses and adding extra load, and that's okay. That's fine. But again, we've got to find out, when we're talking about coming back from injuries, one of the first things we think about is like, how can we make sure we don't make things worse? So we want to keep people, moving and active and getting stronger, so that they can get the benefits of that contralateral strength training effect, so that they can, help form their routines and healthy habits and stay in the routine. But we want to do it in a way that's not going to make matters worse. The second thing that we want to think about is to adjust variables slowly and only a few at a time. So this is something that I used to get wrong a lot, but finally I got a little bit wiser. When someone's coming back from an injury, or when someone's nursing with an injury, I'm a big believer in doing a lot of the same exercises. Now, I know it's boring, no one likes it, I get it, I understand. However, by only changing one or two things each workout, if the person comes back tomorrow or the next day, or is like, hey, man, I didn't feel that great after that workout, it's easy for us to identify, well, what did we change last time that, well, we've done most of these exercises your last 5 times and you were fine. We switched out these 2 and now all of a sudden you have a problem. Well, it's easy for us to identify, okay, so the problem's probably right there, one of those 2 things. And so if there's a setback, if there's a problem, it's a lot easier to identify what that problem was if we're only changing 1 or 2 variables at a time. So especially when someone's easing back into it, I'm a big believer in we'll do a lot of repetitive movements each workout, so that, and slowly sprinkle new things in so that we can just make sure, okay, everything's good. All right, we'll add 1 or 2 things in. And that way, the first sign of any problems, we can quickly identify, like, okay, this must have been the problem because that's the only thing that changed from the week prior, and we can make adjustments to make sure we avoid whatever that thing was that caused the problem. So, and then the third thing to think about when returning back, again, is that dimmer switch versus light switch approach. And it's this idea, I mentioned that, runners are the ones that drive, they're the ones that drive me the most crazy. They'll get, first day back from an injury and they'll go run 5 miles or 7 miles, which is insane. But it happens. So again, we want to increase very gradually, very slowly. Personally, if we're talking about from a strength standpoint, I would say, we never want to increase by more than like 10, generally speaking, I would say like 10% max. If we're gonna, if we did 50 pounds last week, on this exercise, let's go to 55. Let's not go from 50 to 90. We want to go, so just 10% increases. Now, does that mean that progress returning may be a little bit slower than if you pushed yourself 100 miles an hour? Yes, potentially, but it also means that we're a lot more likely to increase any setbacks along the way. So in my opinion, overall, we're going to come out much further ahead. So again, when we look at steps to take to returning from an injury, those are the 3 variables. Do no harm, adjust variables slowly and only a few things at a time so that we can identify if there's any problems, and then ramp up gradually. Those are the 3 things that we really want to focus on, and how we want to go about it. So now, one of the things that we're not, for time purposes, we're not going to go through everything, but if you're watching this at home, I've got a list of different exercises that you could potentially, things that we might want to avoid and things that we might want to add in. I'm going to link the things to add in. I'm going to link videos and share them over email for anyone that wants them, just so you can go through each one by one. The one thing I will talk about is the movements to potentially avoid. And this is a tricky subject because, again, you can't speak in absolutes. Everything requires context and everything falls on a continuum. So when we think about like specific to the low back, because that's, when it comes to injuries, there's 3 areas in particular that we tend to see the most aches and pains, and the low back is definitely at the top of the list. And when we think about what are some common things that we want to avoid with the low back, the first thing at the top of the list would be any sort of like heavy hinging or explosive hinging type movements. By hinging, I mean hinging at the hips. So things where you're doing like a deadlift, where you're keeping your legs straight and bending over, or things where you're doing like an explosive like kettlebell swing and swinging a heavy weight in front of you really fast. Again, for some people, they might be totally fine. But if we're just trying to pick like, okay, someone that has a back issue, what are the first things that I would probably think might not be appropriate for them? It would be that kind of heavy hinging type movements. Again, there's always exceptions to the rule. I've seen a lot of times where someone has back issues, but doing some sort of straight leg deadlift is totally fine, and that's how it works sometimes. There's also people that seem to have no back issues unless they do that 1 or 2 things. So again, there's no one-size-fits-all approach. But if I'm looking at, okay, someone that's got a back issue, what are the first things that I might want to consider removing from having them do? It would be like a heavy kettlebell swing or like a heavy like straight leg deadlift. So could you potentially use lighter weight? Sure. But again, that's just one of the things that I would consider. So The next thing I would say would be running, and I know a lot of people are going to be upset by that, and I sound like I'm very anti-running, and well, I am. Sorry, I blew it. And the reason is because if you think about, when I think of running, so if I told you like, hey, do you think this is good for your body? I want you to stand on your right leg, and I just want you to hop up and down, like a couple thousand times. And then after you get done with that, I want you to stand on your left leg and hop. And just keep hopping, like, 2,000 times. So I want you to do 2,000 hops on your right leg and 2,000 hops on your left leg. Let me know how you feel. Most people would say to that, like, man, that's terrible. That's not good for you. There's no way that can be good for you. But if we alternate hops, we call it running, that's supposed to be okay. So I'm not a big fan of running. And the reason is just because, I've never really seen anything that's caused more injuries over the years. It's a very repetitive movement, and it's just very high impact. If you think about the ground, like the force that's having to be absorbed with every single step we take running, and that coming up throughout your body, I mean, that is brutal. Are there exceptions to the rule? Yes, there's a lot of people out there that could probably run every day the rest of their life, and they would be totally fine. I will say that they are few and far in between, though. Most people, it is just the juice ain't worth the squeeze. Let's put it that way. So I know a lot of people are not going to be happy by saying that, but as someone that's ran in the past, not very far, and mostly from like animals and stuff, but as someone that's ran in the past and working with hundreds of runners over the years, again, it's rough on the old bod. Let me just say that. There's definitely exceptions to the rule, but generally speaking, it's very high impact. And then with the back, the last thing I would mention would be kind of the last thing I would look at potentially removing would be any sort of like rotational movements or twisting. A lot of times, and sometimes sometimes it's fine, but that's one thing that I would consider, potentially minimizing or removing, depending on the severity of the back issue. So the second thing that we see the most injuries with are knee-specific injuries. And again, it could fall in a continuum. It could be just like, my knee's kind of uncomfortable, or like when the weather gets really cold, my knees hurt, or it could be an everyday thing where your knees ache every single day for one reason. It could be genetics, could be an accident, it could be a lot of different things. But when I'm thinking about that, I look at, again, step one would be the running. Sorry, guys. But that's one of the first things that for people that have knee issues, running's usually not going to do you any favors in the long run. So next thing I would look at would be a lot of jumping type movements. So jumping, something that you generally is a lot of times not going to be great. And then the third and final thing would be like forward type lunging movements. And with that, it could be like a walking lunge where I'm lunging down, or it could be some sort of forward lunge where I'm just lunging in place and stepping back. And with both of those, a lot of it it's due to just the amount of stress on that knee joint, in particular when we're coming forward. That can tend to cause some issues. And then the last thing we would look at would be the shoulder joint. So the shoulder joint would be the third and kind of final bucket that comprises of the injuries that we see most commonly. And so with that, the things that we would generally want to avoid a lot of times would be overhead pressing. That's something I would say here at the gym, I would say probably at least a third of the people here, we don't do any overhead pressing with whatsoever due to a shoulder injury, and that's okay. Again, there's other alternatives. There's other things you can do to still strengthen those muscles. But a lot of times with shoulder issues, we will avoid overhead pressing. So that's one of the first things we'll remove. Next thing would be like pressing through a fixed plane of motion. We don't have an issue with this here. An example would be like doing like a barbell bench press. And the reason I say that is because once your hands are on the bar, you can't move your grip around. to work through a range of motion that's natural to you. So doing some sort, or like a seated chest press machine where you're going through a set range of motion, and you can't really, like if you think about like using the TRXs, you can kind of come up, come down, come out, come in. You've got a little bit more flexibility, or a cable chest press, which is a very common exercise. That's, if we look at people that don't have great shoulders, the single arm cable chest press tends to be the pressing movement that's generally going to be best for them, and it's because they can move the elbow up, down, in, out. They can move through a range of motion that's comfortable for them. And then the last thing that we may need to scrap would be single arm core exercises. So if we think about just getting in a push-up position and like putting all of our weight on one arm, for some people with shoulder injuries, there's better alternatives out there. There's a million core exercises, and if someone's got a shoulder issue, a lot of times I would just say, hey, again, we got a million other options. Why not do one of those other 999,000 choices? So, so again, those are kind of when we think about particular movement patterns that we may want to avoid. Those are kind of some of the bigger rocks. There's always exceptions. There's exceptions to where some of these would be fine, and there's exceptions to where there'd be even other things that would bother you. But those are kind of the big rocks as far as within those three categories that you want to think about. So again, if you want a list of potential exercises that you could add in to help, especially with those three areas in particular, let me know. Leave something in the comments below. This is on Facebook and YouTube, so leave a comment or shoot me an email, and we'll get those over to you. So I've got a nice little PDF that way it breaks down what to do, what not to do, and all that fun jazz. So to wrap this up, if you can't tell, I could go on for about 4 more hours, but I don't think anyone wants to listen to me. This is a topic that I am very passionate about, and just to kind of something to leave you to think about. The reason I'm so passionate about this is because it really stems back to my dad, and I saw someone in him that I've been doing this now, I think 21 years as a personal trainer. And, I've been nagging at him for probably, 30 to get active, to work out. And there's always an excuse. Once this happens, once that happens, once my arthritis clears up, once my back stops hurting, once my knees start, there's been something. For 30 years, there's been an excuse. And he's never gotten started. And as a result, his quality of life is horrible. That's all there is to it. He's got, we got my amazing nephew that I love to play trucks with, Cooper, that's 3. My dad's never picked him up. He'll never be able to pick him up. Now got another, he's got his second a grandchild, so never be able to hold her. He doesn't have the strength, so won't be able to get out on the floor and play with him. And he's only 75 years old. He's not that old in the big scheme of things. He loves hunting and fishing. He hasn't been able to do either one of those in 10 years because he can't pick up a gun. So to me, this is such an important subject because it goes so. Yes, this is about exercise, but it's really not. It's about your quality of life. It's about being able to do stuff with your family, your friends, the people that matter most, and that's why I do what I do, and that's why this is a very important topic because I don't want to see anyone not be active and then have to go through life living the way he does. So hopefully, not to end on a low note, but hopefully I gave you something to think about. Like I said, this stuff really matters, and it is a big deal. Like your life truly depends on it, and I hope you picked up at least one thing tonight that you could take away to go live a stronger, healthier life, and so that you can live a long and happy life and do the things you want to do and get down on the floor and play with Cooper. So thanks for watching. Have a great evening.